Hey folks, before I get started, I just want to mention that I'm a podcaster and not a YouTuber, so this whole video making thing is kind of new, and it's not going to be some well-produced video. It's just my webcam and a rant. So this video is about the fact that there is no authoritarian left. There is no authoritarian left. I know right away you want to rail about college students and deplatforming and violent protests that shut down free speech. But if you haven't figured this out yet, there's more to what I'm saying. First, I want to say that I recognize that there have been some examples of bad behavior from protesters and college students that I don't agree with. I don't like seeing anyone hurt or having their shit broken any more than the next person. But that's an emotional response, so I want to set that aside for a minute. I want to take a look at what's actually happening. The number of protests in the U.S. on college campuses in 2017, so we're looking at 6 months, right? But it numbers at less than 20. So there are over 4,700 college campuses in the U.S. And the focus of people who are worried about their free speech is on that less than 20. And I mean, I say less than 20, but that's being generous. In my searches for free speech stories, I found hundreds of news stories, but I found they were all focused on the same 8 or 9 or even 10 events. Assuming that I just couldn't find the rest of them, I'm estimating over 100% more incidents than I could find. In order to err on the steelman position, like I want to say you have the stronger position than you do if you oppose my view. So for over 4,700 college campuses in the U.S., less than 20 instances of overzealous college students crossing the line from protest to killing free speech. And that's if I simply accept that all of the cases that news have presented are actually a case of the students being shitty and authoritarian, which isn't always the case. Quite often these cases are being misrepresented or misreported by people with an agenda, which is why there's a recent study that came out that correlated racism and free speech rhetoric. Not that all people who fight for free speech are racist, but many who use the rhetoric of free speech are doing so in support of racist or bigoted speech and not in support of any other speech. They're doing so with an agenda. But what about online? All these social justice warriors are calling people out for saying things that aren't even racist or sexist or bigoted in any way. So I wonder what people actually mean by this. I've been following SJW culture and anti-SJW culture for a while now, and I see this used as a talking point quite a bit. But I have yet to actually witness this being the case. I had one conversation where I was curious about the definition that people were using about sexism. The idea that women can't be sexist seemed wrong to me, and I was talking about this to another dude. And someone came in with some line about how two dudes shouldn't be talking about this or something like that. So it seemed like exactly what people say it is. Like, oh, you can't talk about sexism, you're a guy. But instead of getting defensive, what somebody needs to do, like what we did in that conversation, was we pushed back a little bit and asked questions. And you get this explanation back about, oh, well, when we talk about sexism in this way, we're talking about gender power dynamics, like men having power in a situation when women don't. And in that sense, in society, women aren't sexist because they don't have the power to be sexist or to control the way things are. And I mean, maybe you can still disagree with that, but that's a more nuanced position, and you can discuss that with somebody even if you don't necessarily agree with it. And you don't have to say, well, they shut down my speech, because what you did is you got defensive. And instead of having a conversation and asking questions and learning something, you instead pushed back and got angry and defensive and said, oh, you're attacking my free speech and you're calling me sexist. Well, that's not exactly what's going on here all the time. I know that a lot of people take issue with call-out culture, and even many people on the so-called far left consider it to have toxic elements. But often it seems that when people are told that what they're saying is racist or sexist or phobic in some way, then they just get defensive and stop listening. And they don't want to hear what's being said. They feel attacked. Even if someone is criticizing their speech, not attacking them as a person. This also isn't shutting down free speech. This is a discussion, and you are allowed to listen and speak back. A good way to figure out if people are attacking you is, are people saying that the words you used are racist? Or are they saying that you are a racist? Like, there's a big difference there. And sometimes people are fucking racist. But that's not necessarily what somebody is saying when they call you out online. There's a lot of outrage going on whenever someone mentions that something can be racist, sexist, or phobic, and not a lot of examination of what that means. So back to college campuses. Aren't the left shutting down speakers they don't agree with in record numbers? And I can't find the exact number of speakers that come and go to college campuses without incident. But it seems reasonable to me to say that with over 4,700 campuses across the United States, that there would be a very large number of speakers. So I went to thefire.org, a right-wing free speech website, and looked for disinvitations and controversial speakers in 2017. So far, out of 4,700 schools, they listed only 11 incidents. And not all of those were individual speakers. There were some double-ups. But there were only five that resulted in a disinvitation. So even of the 11 that they had listed as controversial, less than half of those. You're looking at 5 incidences of disinvitation in 4,700 different schools. And again, that's just looking at the numbers with no context. Without even taking the context and various other issues into account, the numbers simply aren't as scary as they're made out to be. For context on some of these cases, I suggest you check out podcasts like Serious Inquiries Only and Opening Arguments or Polite Conversations with Ina, or any number of shows that take a deeper look at the reason or context and legality surrounding the disinvitations of various speakers. Obviously, don't just take my word for it. There really isn't as much of a free speech issue on college campuses as people seem to think. You might say, Corey, even if this is just one case, even if there is only one case where protesters cross the line, then that's too many. And I'm inclined to agree with you. Like I said at the start, I'm no fan of property damage, and I'm not a fan of seeing people hurt. Even people I don't like. And I really, really don't like some of these people, like Ann Coulter or Milo Yiannopoulos. These people, to me, are the worst. And and I still would not want to see them actually injured. I'm just telling you that these things are being blown way out of proportion by the media and by people with an agenda. And the number of people who are acting this way are far below what some people would have you believe. So I'm going to draw a little analogy. When you talk to somebody about the full moon and they say their son was acting really weird on the full moon this month, so it must be because there was a full moon. I try to point out that there were probably other times that their son acted weird when it wasn't on a full moon and they just attributed it to some other factor. Something that they ignore when it's the full moon. Or you can say that they missed the last 5 full moons where their kid acted normal and didn't think about it twice. They only see the hits. They only recognize these events when they occur in such a way as to warrant attention. All of the full moons and weird days that happen separately never get noticed. In that, I think this is the same. Actions of the left only get noticed when they occur in such a way as to justify it. Protests that go off without a hitch, controversial speakers who say their piece and get called out in a reasonable way, students and teachers who get along on a daily basis while disagreeing about various topics, that shit doesn't make the news. So the next time you see a news story about the left squashing free speech, ask yourself if this is a one-off on this campus. How many other schools have no issues or some form of peaceful protest that goes completely unnoticed? So I've got a bit of a list directly from thefire.org on who got disinvited from campuses, and shit, let me know if this is worth being alarmed about. First, I'm going to mention Milo Yiannopoulos, who was invited to speak at 2 college campuses, according to thefire.org, in 2017. Once at the University of New Mexico for a commencement address, and once at the U of C Berkeley for a debate, quote unquote, debate / speech or whatever. So at the University of New Mexico, there were protesters and hecklers, but he got to do his speech. At the U of C Berkeley, where he got disinvited, it was a matter of safety concerns, and it wasn't the shutting down of free speech by the university. Speaker Ben Shapiro spoke once at Marquette University without any real incident, despite there being multiple student concerns that it was during Black History Month. Charles Murray is listed as disinvited from Middlebury, despite the fact that the university did everything it could to have him speak. And he did speak at the University of Notre Dame, where there were protests, but he still got to speak, and the news coverage of it was extremely limited. There were more, but I guess I'll stop there. The point is, the news is sensationalist and makes a huge deal out of small events, and people with an agenda get worked up about things that would otherwise never be an issue. If a protest doesn't turn violent, then we don't hear about it. If a speaker does their thing and gets debated soundly, we don't hear about it. If you believe the news, the left owns all the universities and never lets anyone speak, and that's simply not the case. I think that's just about all I'm going to say for now on this issue. I think I've made a decent case for why the left isn't really authoritarian, and it's mostly media sensationalism and misinformation spreading at the hands of people with some sort of agenda. I just want to mention a couple more things. First is fear-mongering. Something that seems to come from the idea of the authoritarian left is that you need to be afraid. And I always wonder what I'm supposed to be afraid of. Is it the kids on college campuses? Because I don't think they're scary or even really harmful. Is it people who call me sexist or racist online? Because sometimes I might be, and I may need to hear it. Should I be afraid of people of color gaining power in society? Why should that be scary? Are we worried that they'll treat us the way that we've treated them for so long? Should I be afraid of violence from minority groups? Well, I don't think so, but I think that that's part of where people are going with this. And I think that it comes from negative stereotypes of some groups and people who think that First Nations or Aboriginal people are violent or criminals, or people who think that black people in America are violent or criminals. And these racist stereotypes aren't representative of who people actually are. How can someone decry identity politics and then tell me that I need to be afraid of people of color? The key to this, I think, is that when someone tells you to be afraid, you need to ask why and question that. And lastly, I want to address the threat level here. I know that a lot of people will disagree, but from my perspective, the right is far more dangerous than the left. And there are a couple of reasons why. First is the actual violence that the right is committing. No, I'm not talking about the speech is violent concept that so many people don't seem to grasp. I'm talking about actual murder in the name of their ideas. There are beatings and in a fairly regular basis by people on the right against people who are, well, gay, trans, Muslim, like minority groups of different kinds are being physically assaulted regularly. But that's not what gets headlines. Sensationalist headlines are always calling out the left. And I see a group of quote unquote liberals who are always focused on the left while there's actual violence happening on the right. And like I say, I don't want to grab onto these headlines after calling people out for that very thing, but there have been genuine murders done in the name of racism, and the numbers seem to be on the rise. Like, this is concerning to me. This is violence, real violence. While everybody's arguing about punching a Nazi, one dude punching one dude, or even two dudes punching one dude, the right has been actually hurting multiple people in multiple places. So sure, I don't care if you support punching a Nazi, but I don't want you to pretend that it's a bigger deal or a bigger threat than the violence perpetrated by the pro-Trump, right-wing, anti-Muslim, racist assholes. So that's that. And the second reason that I'm worried more about the right than the left is that the right now has somebody in power who hates free speech. Like, I know that you don't see it that way. I know that the right doesn't see it that way. And many classical liberals don't see it that way either. But Donald Trump, the acts by the president and his staff and the way they deal with the press is a far bigger deal when it comes to free speech than the odd controversial speaker getting shut down on college campuses. There are press being charged for being around various anti-Trump protests. There are press being shut out of White House briefings, and if the reports I've read are right, then one of the new rules is that there are no cameras allowed in some of those briefings. So you have a genuine threat to free speech in the White House, and you're worried about college kids. I think that you need to check your priorities. So that's all. I don't see that there's a real threat to free speech here. I don't think that there's an authoritarian left. With that, I want to say thanks for listening. If you're a patron already, then you got to hear this well ahead of time, and I really appreciate your support. If you're not, then you can go to my Patreon account at patreon.com/hardcoreskeptic and give me $1 a month or whatever. You can follow the podcast on Spreaker.com/thehardcoreskepticexamines and check out my series of interviews on social justice topics. I have 7 episodes out right now, but I still have almost 20 in processing and another 5 lined up. So I'll be covering social justice for a while. You can follow me on Twitter at Hardcore Skeptic or like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Hardcore Skeptic. And if you like my work and want more of it, then you can check out my long-running podcast, Brainstorm, on iTunes, Stitcher, Spreaker, or wherever you find podcasts. Thanks again for watching or listening, and remember, the truth matters. Get those straggly hairs out of the way.